In this Component 1 screencast on sociological theory, we're going to consider a perspective called postmodernism. And you can see on this theory map that postmodernism doesn't really fit with any of the mainstream theories. And that's because, as we shall see, postmodernist theory is really a challenge to mainstream sociology. And there are two main arguments that postmodernists make. Firstly, they argue that contemporary societies have undergone radical social change over the last 30 to 40 years, that we're now living in a new historical epoch that is completely different from previous types of societies. And then the second argument that they make is that because of these profound social changes, a lot of the ideas and theories that we've used in sociology are no longer as relevant as they used to be. So let's begin by looking at the first argument, that society has undergone rapid social change over the last 30 to 40 years. So whereas in the past people's lives often followed a predictable pattern or order that didn't vary much from generation to generation, this is no longer the case according to the postmodernist perspective. And this is because postmodernists argue that social behaviour is no longer shaped as it used to be by people's social background and their socialisation. And therefore they argue that some of the factors that sociologists have traditionally studied, such as social class and gender, influence people a great deal less than they used to. And instead people are much freer to choose their own identity and lifestyle. So postmodernists argue that people from all types of social backgrounds now have much more choice about things like their family life, their sexuality, where they live, what sort of people they mix with, their fashion, their music, etc. So this new type of society called postmodernity has been described really as a time of incessant choosing, where many established conventions and old certainties are called into question. And questions such as who am I, how should I live my life, questions of identity and lifestyle have become much more open than they were for previous generations. So postmodernists argue that as a result of these changes, the boundaries between social groups are breaking down, and that you can no longer predict the sorts of lifestyles that people will adopt. So questions of identity and lifestyle are much more down to the individual than they were for previous generations. And whereas this can create more opportunities and more freedom for individuals, it also can create higher degrees of anxiety and uncertainty. And we can use the example of gender roles to illustrate the postmodernist argument. So if we go back to the early part of the 20th century, gender roles within our culture were clearly differentiated. And at the time, the traditional view is that men and women had different roles because this reflected natural differences between men and women. Later on in the 20th century, this idea of gender roles being based on biology was challenged. It was challenged by sociologists, particularly those influenced by the feminist perspective, who argued that the differences between men and women weren't the product of biology, they were the product of culture and socialization. In other words, masculinity and femininity weren't boxes that we were born into, but they were boxes that we grew into through a process of socialization that transmitted particular gender roles. However, postmodernists would argue that it's no longer as meaningful and relevant to talk about masculinity and femininity as opposing categories. Their argument is that gender roles have undergone a process of fragmentation, and there are now lots of different ways of doing girl, lots of different ways of doing boy that all begin to blur and overlap. So we can't really talk about masculinity and femininity according to this perspective. We should talk about different types of masculinities, different types of femininities that blur and overlap. So postmodernists argue that people's identities are shaped much more by personal choice and are less static than they used to be, that they're more fluid, they're more flexible, they're more likely to change than was the case in the past. And postmodernists argue that lifestyles and identities based on consumption have become much more important in contemporary societies, that identities are no longer as strongly based on how people earn their money, in other words, a matter of their occupation and their social class, but much more on how they spend it, in other words, a matter of their consumer lifestyle. So the argument here is that people define themselves in terms of the choices that they make about clothes, about cars, about music, about fashion, and so on, and that their identities are based on these consumer decisions rather than things like where we live or our family or our class or our gender. And according to this perspective, consumer goods are important not so much for their use value, but more for their symbolic value. In other words, what these consumer goods say about the taste and lifestyle of the consumers. Think, for example, of the importance of brands and labels and the images that we associate with these things. So the argument is that individuals self-consciously arrange these symbols into a recognizable lifestyle. So just to recap, the postmodernist argument, firstly, is that contemporary societies have completely changed in the last 30 or 40 years, that the boundaries between social groups are breaking down, and that key social institutions have undergone a process of fragmentation. Now, the second argument that we can see here follows on from the first argument. So the second argument is that because of these changes, a lot of the concepts and theories that we've used traditionally in sociology are now past their sell-by date. So postmodernists are particularly critical of any attempt to produce a general sociological theory of how society works. Their argument is that you cannot truly explain something as complex and increasingly fluid and fragmented as the social world. So from this perspective, the generalizations that sociologists typically make about the relationship between social institutions and individual behaviour and the comparison that they make between different social groups, these things have become increasingly difficult to sustain. So big theories like Marxism and feminism and functionalism that try to make these types of generalizations about society are seen as being past their sell-by date. And in fact, many postmodernists would argue that such theories, what they call grand narratives, can actually be quite dangerous because they can be used by groups of people to impose their ideas on other people. So from a postmodernist perspective, the job of the sociologist is not to impose their view of society on others, but merely to enable the voices of different people within society to be heard. Once again, in addition to watching and making notes on this video, make sure that you've also worked through the online lesson on postmodernism prior to the lesson. And this screencast concludes the introductory work we've been doing on core sociological theories, and what we're going to do in the next section of component 1 is take all of the concepts and theories that we've been introducing so far and start to apply them to a topic in depth called youth cultures.